Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. You're currently joining us for the fourth webinar of the Essentials of Literacy Local Leaders. Now, it's been a while since we've graced your screens with a webinar, so I hope you're all able to switch off for some of the school holidays in anticipation for whatever lies ahead in Term 4. It's been great to see so many of you continuing to engage online, watching the webinar recording, submitting webinar assignments, posting on the discussion board and connecting with your virtual community of practice, or completing the mid-course evaluation. As with all of our webinars, we have assembled another group of masterful master trainers who will facilitate today's webinar, and I can't wait for you to be introduced to them shortly. Today's webinar has been timed perfectly, as its focus on balanced assessment can give you some food for thought over the coming term as you all head back towards face-to-face teaching and consider the assessment methods you have and will use with your students. Hello to all. So just before we begin, some housekeeping reminders. Hello to all of you watching with the live streaming again. Everyone knows the drill by now, but just as you have for all previous sessions, we'd love you to view today's webinar through the Webinar 4 page in Basto 307, as you have immediate access to the YouTube live stream, the Padlet back channel, your webinar assignment, and your discussion board prompt. Remember that the Padlet is a great opportunity for you to respond in real time with your experiences and questions about the webinar content. It's been lovely to see people saying hi to everyone this afternoon, but please keep in mind that Basto does expect these posts to continue to be positive and respectful. While we always encourage you to watch the webinars live with us at home, we understand that things come up. So please note that Webinar 4 is being recorded in real time and will be uploaded to Basto 307 in the coming days, so you can catch up on anything you've missed. If you're out of the swing of things and experiencing any technical difficulties, please send through an email to digital.learning@basto.vic.edu.au and the digital team will be able to assist. So without further ado, let's get into Webinar 4 with a focus on balanced assessment. Over to you, Bron, to introduce the session and the team.
Thanks, Laura. It's so wonderful to be here today. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. I recognise and honour their ongoing connection to land, water and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people who may be with us today. So now I'd love to give you an introduction to the team of master trainers that we've assembled here today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Chris, who's an assistant principal teaching and learning literacy at Bacchus Marsh Primary School, which is a school of 930 students across 38 classes, 60 kilometres from Melbourne. He coaches across all professional learning teams, and the current focus in the school is upon using formative assessment practices to inform curriculum planning. Next, we have Amanda, who is an assistant principal, curriculum and pedagogy at Hughesdale Primary, which is situated 20 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. There are 570 students and a teaching team dedicated to using evidence-based teaching practices to develop students to full potential. She's had a varied career as a classroom teacher and as a leading teacher in the North East Region School Improvement Team. I'd like to introduce you to Lisa. She's a leading teacher, head of literacy and PLC at Swan Hill College, a regional school 4 hours north of Melbourne of around 750 students. She's been a master trainer for the past 3 years and is also a facilitator of LDAP Secondary for the Basto Institute. She teaches VCE literature, her particular passion, as well as middle school writing electives. Andrew is a learning specialist at Athol Road Primary School in Springvale South, which has approximately 390 students with a high percentage of students that speak English as a second language. He teaches in the 3-4 learning space and has been focusing on strengthening literacy practices across the school. And I'm Bron. I'm an assistant principal for excellence in teaching and learning at Wangaratta High School in Victoria's northeast. I coach learning area leaders and learning specialists to strengthen their pedagogy of the teaching of writing across the school. I've just stepped into the secondary space after more than 15 years in primary schools, and I'm loving building my skills in the classroom as a teacher of Year 7 English as well. So let's direct our attention now to the series overview. We've been really fortunate to have worked with the gradual release of responsibility, followed by the workshop model. Our last webinar, session 3, was centred around authentic literacy and student agency. Today we're going to build on these ideas and bring you a really balanced approach to assessment. Our webinar will be followed by the final webinar, Planning and Integrating Literacy Teaching, after which you're going to reassemble in virtual communities of practice to share, reflect and take the next steps together in this work. It's really important that between webinars, everyone's taking the opportunity to share their learning, whether it's conversations you've had or ideas from a webinar that you've trialled back at school. This is the best way for you to connect with your virtual community of practice and continue to be inspired, not only by the master trainers presenting, but also learning from your peers. So this is our agenda for this afternoon or this evening. As you can see, there's a picture there of some little balanced acrobats, which I think is a really great analogy of the work that we do around balanced assessment. This also happens to be my 9-year-old son's new favourite ISO toy. But I think that there's some real parallels that we can make today around assessment. So first of all, we're going to start with background to balanced assessment. And here Lisa's going to share some research and ensure that we all have a really strong grounding in the theory of why this approach is integral to our teaching of readers and writers. Andrew is then going to lead us through the assessment of readers and Amanda the assessment of writers, giving practical strategies and examples of how we can use this approach to improve learning growth for all of our students. There's then going to be time to complete your webinar assignment and also a Q&A session at the end where our team's going to address some of the key questions coming from our Padlet. So educators need to take a balanced approach to assessment, and this is the underpinning, the essential underpinning of our work today. Our learning intention, and when we discuss our learning intentions, both with adult learners such as yourselves and with our students, it's really important that we highlight what we'll be learning and why. So our learning intention today is to build and strengthen the understanding of a balanced assessment model to inform our literacy teaching and learning. This is the what, to build and strengthen understanding of balanced assessment. The why, to inform our literacy teaching and learning. This is followed by our success criteria, which is really designed to measure the effectiveness, the quality by which you've learned. So our success criteria, I can select a range of instructional strategies and artefacts to represent balanced assessment in my classroom to inform my teaching. There's going to be time later in the webinar to work on our webinar assignment. And we will share this later on in the session because we don't want to distract you early on. So just keep in mind your assessment practices that you're currently using, as well as your takeaways from the webinar to implement later in your classroom and school. So as we're working, just keep that in the back of your mind that there will be this assignment, and it's really going to centre around what you're doing now and what you're going to be doing next. So let's introduce the Padlet here. And we're going to set the first prompt for today. So we've got our Padlet. It's open for business. Laura mentioned that early, and it's ready for your responses. And already there's some fantastic ones in there. My personal favourite so far is the picture of the holiday that wasn't taken, and that's making me feel really jealous. So even though that holiday wasn't taken, imagining myself there is fantastic. So it's great. Please introduce yourself. We'd love to see you interacting with each other, sharing your thoughts, questions, experiences and responses to our prompts along the way. So, tell us who you are, your school, your role, and describe some of the tools that you currently use to assess reading and writing in your school. So that's about it from me for now. I'm going to pass the baton across to Lisa, who's going to take us through balanced assessment.
Thanks, Bron. Hi to everyone out there. I usually say from sunny Swan Hill, but not so much today. We've got a little bit of rain, and a special hello to all the people from the Southern Mallee. I can see some familiar names there. So Bron's right. We're going to focus at the start here about balanced assessment in particular. A really important component of FISO, which you're very familiar with. So this workshop is going to focus on an aspect of FISO, evaluating the impact on learning, a critical component for any teacher in school aiming to strive for practice excellence and improve students' learning outcomes. We need to know if our curriculum programs and teaching and learning and strategies utilised in our classrooms are actually making a difference and how students feel about their learning. So to find out, We need quality data from a range of sources. So today we're going to consider the formative assessment data that is most useful in improving students' literacy outcomes. You've already explored the workshop model earlier in the course, which is a research-based approach to effectively teaching all aspects of literacy. There are a number of opportunities within this model to collect formative assessment and provide feedback, most of which should be planned prior to a lesson. Before we delve into the specific formative assessment practices, we need to spend a bit of time understanding what we mean by assessment in general. Now, some of you might have seen this pyramid before, and I must admit when I first saw it a number of years ago, it excited me because it really encapsulates, I guess, the way I hope we're all going to see assessment and where most of our energies should be directed. So this pyramid represents the types of assessments typically used at schools. At the bottom, although we would argue the most important component, is formative assessment. And the size of the base of the pyramid really is symbolic of this. Now, formative assessment constitutes things like the readers and writers' notebook entries, information gleaned from conferences and observations, and student surveys. Now, it's these assessments that help teachers shape their instructional decisions, and they can be both formal and informal means of gathering crucial student learning data. Now, above that on the pyramid is the end of unit assessments that a lot of us are familiar with, especially our secondary school teachers. They're things like tests, essays, products which inform us about student learning, but aren't always used to inform the next steps in our teaching, which is what we're really going to be focusing on today. Above that again, and a narrower block, are benchmark assessments in schools that are usually one of more of PADA, reading, on-demand or Fontes-Pinnell benchmark assessments. Now, they do help schools understand cohort trends and can measure the impact of longer-term literacy interventions that a school might make. At the top of the pyramid, and while the media and lots of people focus on that top end, the NAPLAN data and VCE exams, we'd argue they're actually not the most important in driving student learning in a day-to-day basis. They are useful when considering school trends over time, but much less informative about individual student progress and learning needs. So if we're really serious about improving student outcomes, unless there's a rigorous system of formative assessment where teachers are assessing on an ongoing basis, using information to inform their teaching, these other assessments above on the top end of the pyramid are rendered impotent. They exist at the margins of formative assessment. School administrations often focus on those top two tiers, when in fact their time and energy would be much better spent developing a strategic and rigorous formative assessment processes. So let's define exactly what we mean by formative assessment a bit more closely before we go any further. As I read a definition from Moss and Brookhart to you, I want you to think about whether this describes what happens in your school at the moment, in your school and in your classroom. Formative assessment is an active and intentional learning process that partners the teacher and the students to continuously and systematically gather evidence of learning with the express goal of improving student achievement. Teachers and their students actively and intentionally engaged in the formative assessment process when they work together to focus on learning goals, take stock of where current work is in relation to that goal, and take action to move closer to the goal. Now, the formative assessment process aligns with what happens in the classroom day to day and minute by minute with three central questions that we ask ourselves and we want our students to ask. Where am I going? Where am I now? What strategy or strategies can help me to get to where I need to go? We'll consider these questions in a little bit more detail later. So the primary focus of formative assessment is to improve learning, not merely audit or assess it. It is assessment for learning rather than the assessment of learning that we're really serious about. This quote is a wonderful one, and if you want to show anyone anything from my little presentation about assessment, I suspect this could be a good one to stimulate discussion. It's from Lee and Willem, and it sums up the power of formative assessment. So when formative assessment practices are integrated into the minute-to-minute and day-by-day classroom activities of teachers, substantial increases in student achievement of the order of 70 to 80% increase in the speed of learning are possible. And as we know, Hattie, who you've all heard of, is a really strong advocate of formative assessment based on his extensive research into it. He actually argues that an effective practitioner engages in high quality instructional practices, which includes direct instruction, but along with frequent assessment and feedback to the learner. And now as teachers, we have access to so much formative data that's right in front of us every day in the classroom. There's so much learning that takes place. And what we've got to do is get smarter at collecting and analysing that data to inform our practice. When it comes to literacy, there are opportunities in all discipline areas to better understand what we need to do to support our learners. And look, I admit, it can sound a little bit overwhelming to think about collecting formative learning data in the classroom every minute, every day, but later we'll explore some effective strategies with Amanda and Andrew that are really easy to implement to do this. So we're going to argue today, basically, that the main thing is to keep to the main thing, if you know what I mean. And we're going to argue that it's formative assessment where the power is. So if the attention of teachers and leaders on assessment in our schools is not on that symbolic base of the pyramid, there simply won't be the improvement in the other measures that often grab the headlines. So with an understanding of formative assessment data, our next question is, so what should we be collecting formative literacy data about? Now, a balanced approach to assessment would include finding out about the whole student. So it's important that teachers design learning activities to capture what our students know and can do, and I think we're all pretty familiar with that. However, sometimes we forget that understanding their attitudes and motivations is equally important, and I would argue really important as our students are returning to school from remote learning. We need to understand these things because their dispositions towards reading and writing are essential if we're going to actually be able to design interventions that work. Now, if you work as a PLC school or in teams in a collaborative manner, you might be familiar with the inquiry cycle that focuses closely on the collection and analysis of formative assessment data. This graphic outlines a process similar to that teachers could use to both formally and informally evaluate the impact of their teaching and differentiate the next steps for students based on their learning intentions and success criteria. So as teachers, we want to be really strategic about the sort of data we're generating, what evidence have we got of student learning. We need to become do critical analysis and interpret the data and evidence, figure out what sort of impact our teaching is having, and then determine the next steps for our learners. So there are actually 5 key strategies for formative assessment if we're to create a classroom environment where we both collect and use literacy learning data effectively. Using the workshop model helps create that learning environment conducive to formative assessment data collection. Now, the first of those strategies is to clarify and share learning intentions and success criteria. A mini lesson in our workshop model, which is clearly focused, will enable us to do that. The second point is to engineer effective classroom discussions, activities and tasks that elicit evidence of learning. So in the workshop model again, there's lots of work time where students are in their notebooks, their readers or writers' notebooks, and substantive talk can take place. The third feature of effective formative assessment is providing feedback that moves the learning forward. Conferring with individuals or small groups provides us with wonderful opportunities for specific feedback based on formative literacy data that has been collected. We also want to activate learners as instructional resources for one another. So within that work time, we want to provide students with opportunities to work together and provide each other with feedback. And the last point that's important about formative assessment is we really want to try to create our learners as owners of their own learning. We want them to be metacognitive about their learning and use that feedback to achieve the learning goals that we and they have set themselves. Now, there's a lot there about formative assessment that you're probably curious about, but we're going to look at two aspects right now. We're going to have a close look at the importance of learning intentions and success criteria and their role in formative assessment and effective feedback. Now, I know you're probably in a school like I am where we seem to have looked at learning intentions and success criteria a lot, and to varying degrees of success. But I wonder sometimes, is it because we haven't really made that close connection between learning intentions and success criteria and formative assessment? So one of the key elements of good lesson design and explicit instruction is clarity around what we aim for students to be able to understand and do as a result of the learning activities we've selected. We need to be able to communicate what students are aiming for and how to get there in student-friendly language. Now, as we know, learning intentions are descriptions of what students should know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a learning period or unit. These learning intentions are the basis for tracking student progress, providing feedback, and assessing achievement. So they're vital if you're going to be really strategic about collecting formative assessment data. Success criteria are equally important. They're the measures used to determine whether and how well learners have met the learning intentions. So clear learning intentions and success criteria ensure teachers know what evidence of learning they are looking for. So when you've got that whole lot of learning going on, if you're really clear about what you're collecting data about, and that's clarified in the learning intentions and success criteria, it's a lot easier. Now, these have a major influence on achievement with an effect size of 0.75. So you can't formatively assess a student against a curriculum content descriptor unless you know what they need to do to get there. That requires an understanding of the skills and knowledge, which translates into quite specific learning intentions and success criteria in every lesson. Now, this graphic and the information on the next slide come from some work presented at a Northwest Regional online PD that I did. And I thought it was a really good way of clarifying these two elements of good lesson design. It reminds us that learning intentions need to be planned prior to a lesson and communicated to students so that they know what the learning goal is. Learning intentions are most effective when they are clearly articulated and referenced throughout a lesson. So if you have a look at that graphic there, before, during and after lesson, it articulates for you why learning intentions are important throughout. Now we're just going to unpack a little bit more about success criteria. Success criteria are need to be related directly to learning to help the teacher to evaluate student progress. They should be written in language that students can understand. They are used as criteria to assess student progress and understanding of key skills and knowledge. They outline the key skills, knowledge, and understanding students need to achieve. They should be used when providing feedback to students about their work. And they follow a natural progression of learning that allows multiple entry and exit points. In an effective lesson, they're also used as criteria for student self-assessment opportunities. And generally, there are around 3 to 5 learning statements that are used to guide success in that lesson. So it's really important that these success criteria are developed because they do make that connection between the learning outcome and the goal that the students are targeting, and provides you with an opportunity to give good feedback as well. Now, a focus on collecting formative literacy data helps teachers to communicate quality feedback, feed up, feed up, feedback, and feed forward that helps students answer those three questions I referred to earlier. Where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? Now, the Victorian Education Department provides a really good professional learning resource that examines ideas relevant to the work of learning specialists. Module 4 in that package, and there's a link here on the slide that you'll have access to after this workshop, it focuses on quality teaching that uses assessment to differentiate instruction. In it, Lynn Sharrett explains the importance of powerful formative assessment and the power of co-constructed success criteria for learning growth, as well as how effective feedback to students is contingent upon these practices. Now, the graphic we're about to show you is typically called the waterfall graphic, and in it, Sharrett shows the links between learning intentions, success criteria, feedback, peer and self-assessment, and goal setting, and how all of these are essential components in classroom practice that is focused on gathering data about student learning. So that's a good resource for you to access after this webinar. Another one you might like to is a series of masterclasses on formative assessment developed by Narissa Leong, a literacy consultant, who amongst other things facilitates intakes of leading literacy at Basto. So when there are shared learning intentions and success criteria, and formative assessments have been utilised to assist students to set their own learning goals and monitor their own progress, students are actually much more likely to engage in their learning. So specifically, quality and regular feedback to students about writing, reading, vocabulary and listening and speaking skills is more successful in developing students who see themselves as readers and writers than a PADR or a NAPLAN result ever will. And Moss and Brookard, as you can see on the slide here, really articulate how effective feedback is crucial to student motivation. Now, I must admit, I love a good graph, and this is another one that I like. The traffic light colours make it pretty easy for us to understand. It's what Hattie says about feedback. And he breaks it down into the red, imagine if you didn't tell your kids anything, or you're not having much impact, if you're a bit average, and then what the high impact strategies are. And you'll notice on that graph that giving effective feedback has a 0.79 effect size, which is massive. Now, effective teachers use two-way feedback to gather information about student understandings, to assist students to advance their own learning, and to verify the impact of their own practice. Now, capturing effective feedback over time provides a window into the learning process that is evidence-based and rich in context. Hattie actually argues that feedback is one of the most powerful influences on learning and achievement if you get it right. And that's, if you get it right, it's the key part. So when you have a look at this table about effective feedback, I want you to think about the quality of the feedback you provide students on the formative literacy assessment data you collect. Some sorts of feedback actually have a far greater impact on student learning than others. So if you have a look at this graph, again, the traffic light colours make it easier for us to understand. You can see the feedback level on the left-hand column: praise, task, process and self-regulation, and the types of questions that the feedback might answer. So for example, praise, give a student praise, how good am I? You might just say something like, well done, this is excellent work. Well, actually, according to the research, that is ineffective in improving student learning outcomes. And you might be interested to see that task-oriented feedback about next time you write, provide more detail is useful, but the most powerful types of feedback is actually about processes and self-regulation. And I think that's a really good thing to reflect on when you think about the type of feedback you give your students, particularly in individual conferences that you might have. So consider whether your feedback is specific enough. Is it focused on skills and knowledge? And does it provide students with information about how they completed a task so that they can apply the process they learnt to future tasks and become more metacognitive about their learning? So I've told you a few things about a formative assessment and the links to feedback this afternoon. I'm going to finish with this quote that I want you to think about, because I think it really perfectly captures how I hope you come to see formative assessment in your classroom. In a classroom that uses assessment to support learning, the divide between instruction and assessment blurs. Everything students do, such as conversing in groups, completing set work, answering and asking questions, working on projects, handing in homework assignments, even sitting silently and looking confused, is a potential source of information about how much they understand. The teacher who consciously uses assessment to support learning takes in this information, analyses it, and makes instructional decisions that address the understandings and misunderstandings that these assessments reveal. The amount of information can be overwhelming. One teacher likened it to negotiating a swiftly flowing river. So a key part of using assessment for learning is figuring out how to hone in on a manageable range of alternatives. So I'm just going to finish with that focus on negotiating a swiftly flowing river. Sounds like it's a bit much, and that we've used the word overwhelming a couple of times today. So I just want to sum up what are the most important things I want you to think about with formative assessment. We really want you to be strategic. We want you to plan carefully. We want you to really think about what is it exactly you want students to be able to do and how your learning intentions are going to articulate that. How are you going to actually express the success criteria to students and have those linked to individual learning goals? We'd like you to be thinking in a systematic way about every time you walk in that classroom, what is it exactly you're trying to find out about your learners? We also want you to think of this as an ongoing process and really want to emphasise that formative assessment is the way to shape your future teaching and the learning of your students. So to summarise the need for balanced assessment in our classrooms, the key point is really to be strategic. While some of this data collection might be informal, careful planning should ensure that it's ongoing and systematic. I hope this short presentation spurs you to action, encourages you to reflect about your practice, and maybe gets you excited about the opportunities we have to assist our students in meaningful ways. Thanks for listening this afternoon. I hope you had an opportunity to pause and reflect about your practice. It's over to Chris now, who'll lead you into the next part of our webinar.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Well, let's press the pause button because our intention for that initial phase was to develop your capacity to have a shared understanding of what constitutes balanced assessment. We've had a tsunami across the Padlet, which is just wonderful because when we posed our first Padlet question, describe the tools you currently use in and around reading and writing assessment, wow, the list was absolutely amazing. And I'm just grabbing from the actual Padlet. We had F&P, we had PM, we had Big Write, hot tasks, cold tasks, comparison to vels, work samples, torch, essential assessments, conferences, pre and post testing, PAT, probe, moderation, F&P continua, essential learnings, Dylan Williams' work, and so much more. Such a rich list of all of the components of assessment. Now, our challenge and our task is really to come to an understanding, to come to a shared understanding of what constitutes, as Lisa was articulating, what constitutes the balance. And that balance, looking at that Padlet list, we could audit that list and reflect ourselves and say, well, how many of those would come under that category of formative and how many of those would come under the category of summative? And that's the next stage of our thinking and our work. And just pausing right now, I always have the analogy here with formative assessment, and Lisa made this really clear. It's as if we're an executive chef and we have to continually taste the soup along the way. Keep it intentional, keep it strategic. Some of the amazing research that Lisa has pulled together there, it came back again to the workshop model, how the workshop model offers so many opportunities for formative assessment. The balanced assessment pyramid is such a strong metaphor. And I love the ISO toy that Bron shared. That's what it's like. That foundation where we have to be really aware what's in our formative assessment repertoire coming up to the more summative forms at the top of the pyramid. The key definitions that we get from Moss and Brookhart and Lay and Dylan William, they are just so profound and so important to us that we are gathering evidence, and the express goal is to improve student learning and achievement. Now, if the assessment tool doesn't do that, the logical sort of component is we need to audit and say, of what value is it to us? We heard about Hattie and the wonderful work that he's doing, and the work that Lisa put together around feedback and what constitutes effective feedback really points to what is quality formative assessment. And quality formative assessment obviously enables us to do that. And the Sharrett waterfall was a great synthesis of all of those components. It enabled us, in essence, to look at the workshop model. It enables us to have those opportunities for the feedback. And I love that view of where am I going, feeding up, how am I going, feeding back, and where to next. I think we often reflect with assessment, if we get the assessment in front of us and we can't answer the where to next, well, it's not formative. We haven't got the pathway clear. So we hope that that development of the key ideas for you around balanced assessment will be fantastic in underpinning your movement forward. Let's get back to the Padlet. And now what we'd like you to do, and again, thank you so much for sharing what is current practice for you. Now, given the learning that you've undertaken with Lisa, of the formative assessment tools, and now you're going to have to sort of audit what you're working with your assessment, of those which are formative and of those which have a strong impact on student learning, a strong impact. And if you could articulate why, that would be wonderful for the next phase of our Padlet discussion. Thanks so much for engaging up to this point with that discussion. Okay, so let's now move to the practicality. Our intention in this webinar is to look at formative assessment in the realms of reading and writing. So I'm going to introduce Andrew, and Andrew's going to look at our assessment of readers and specifically address again our success criteria, developing a range of instructional strategies and artefacts to represent balanced assessment to inform my teaching in reading. And he's also going to touch on that aspect of the attitudinal component, impacting and fostering positive attitudes and dispositions towards reading using tools and techniques. Over to you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Chris and Lisa. We're going to start by looking at a web which outlines a range of strategies and tools teachers and schools can use to assess readers, both formative and summative. Portfolios of work, which can be digital or in physical forms, such as the Reader's Notebook, are an excellent assessment tool. They can demonstrate students' progression of reading goals, their comprehension of texts, their reading depth and breadth, and their interests. Benchmark assessments such as Ponder-Sempionnel and PM, which many schools use, are used to assess reading behaviours, comprehension and fluency. They measure progress over longer periods of time and are delivered in a highly standardised way. Student Think Alouds are also a form of assessment and can reveal students' comprehension of texts. Assessments constructed by teachers for a particular purpose can focus on a range of different areas, including engagement, interests, comprehension, phonics, or phonemic awareness. Anecdotal observations teachers make are an important assessment strategy. Teachers can record observations regarding reading behaviours, comprehension, substantive talk, fluency, student engagement, and reading interests. Reading conferences are a great way to assess students' comprehension. Their reading behaviours, fluency, engagement, reading interests, phonics, and phonemic awareness. Running records are taken when teachers listen to students read and they can be used to assess, again, a student's reading behaviours, comprehension, accuracy and fluency. Finally, the VCAA Insight Assessment Platform contains further information and assessment tools, including the English Online Interview, Abilities-Based Learning and Education Support, or ABLES, Diagnostic Assessment Tools in English, and TEAL, Tools for Enhancing Assessment Literacy for Teachers of English as an Additional Language. So each day we as educators have the opportunity to strategically choose a formative assessment to learn more about the readers in our classes. We can't possibly cover all of these practices, but today we're going to take a closer look at conferring and the reader's notebook as forms of assessment. Conferring is when teachers schedule a time with students to have a conversation about what the student has read in independent reading. Texts are generally selected independently by students to read, and discussions draw upon the principles of a dialogic classroom or substantive talk. When conferring is done well, teachers learn what the student is thinking when they read and the strategies they are using to help them make meaning when they read. This is a powerful form of formative assessment, and the information the teacher gains from this assessment can be used for immediate instruction. Once again, teachers can use conferring to assess students' accuracy, fluency, comprehension, but also their reading motivation, engagement, and interests. There are different approaches to reading conferences for different purposes. Choosing a conferring strategy is an important part of the process. Some things to consider include what the student is reading, whether they are midway through the book or finish the book. To effectively use reading conferences as an assessment strategy, the teacher needs to ensure they are prepared and thinking about what they can do before, during, and after the reading conference. Before the reading conference, the teacher can reread any anecdotal notes or previous reading goals they have been working on and start to think about where the student might need to head to next. Preparing discussion points or prompts that address the student's goal is also an important consideration before conferring with a student. During the reading conference, the teacher can encourage the student to articulate their goal and determine whether it has been reached, which is a key part of this assessment strategy. The prompting questions and discussion starters that were planned for may be used during the reading conference, and this is a time to show genuine interest in the student's thoughts, ideas, and opinions. Depending on the student, the teacher might choose to listen to them read. This is especially important for younger readers and EAL readers or students who benefit from reading aloud. If the teacher is going to listen to the student read, they can take a running record with a focus on assessing accuracy and fluency. Reading conferences are a fantastic strategy because they provide an opportunity to monitor and assess students' progress with their reading goals and their reading in general, and then provide students with explicit feedback and on-the-spot instruction. Formative assessment that leads to immediate instruction is very powerful. So Jennifer Saravello has a great book on reading conferences and the different approaches that teachers can take. One of her conference strategies is called Research, Decide, Teach, and it involves researching and assessing the student's thinking, and then using this assessment to target an on-the-spot teaching point. If you'd like to learn more about this strategy and see it in action, you can easily find it on YouTube. And there's also a great example of a reading conference in action on the literacy portal under the teaching practices for reading and viewing. Reading conferences provide the perfect platform for teachers and students to set new goals for further learning together. Some things to think about to do this effectively include helping the student articulate a new goal and planning together what needs to be done for the student to successfully achieve the goal. After the reading conference, the teacher can determine if there are students with similar needs that can be targeted through small group instruction, such as guided reading. Another important step for the teacher to take is to reflect on how the conference went and record student progress, which we'll take a little bit more of a look at now. It is important for teachers to keep a clear record of reading conference in order to track their progress. The observations we keep connect back to all the things we can assess readers for, which we discussed when we looked at the assessment of Reader's Web. Interests, engagement, accuracy, fluency, comprehension, and how they're explaining their thinking about what they have read. If we provide specific feedback based on assessment and form goals with students, this is also important to record. There are a number of different templates, such as those that can be found in Jennifer Saravallo's book, and there is also a template that can be found in the Literacy Teaching Toolkit. So some teachers might prefer to keep their records of reading conferences by hand or digitally. Tools such as Excel or Google Classroom, Google Forms, Seesaw, they all have the capability to record conferences and student progress in different and creative ways. There isn't one set way that this needs to be done. However, consistency in record keeping is important. If you are focusing on reading conferences as formative assessment in a PLC, you might agree to record information from conferences in a consistent way across your team. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the Reader's Notebook as an assessment tool now. The Master Trainers in the last webinar on authentic literacy discussed Reader's Notebooks. We really want to highlight the value of the Reader's Notebook and how they are used as a tool for students to capture their thinking and understanding about texts. They are flexible enough to allow students to respond in a variety of ways, and the responses written in the Reader's Notebook also reflect the particular ways that students have been taught to respond to texts. Today, we'll be looking at the Reader's Notebook through an assessment lens. Reader's Notebooks are a highly valuable formative assessment tool for both primary and secondary students. It is important for both teachers and students understand that the Reader's Notebook is part of the assessment process. To do this effectively, teachers read the notebooks on a regular basis to get a window into the depth of their students' thinking. When they assess students' thinking in the notebook, they consider evidence over several entries for a specific time frame. Students can also bring their Reader's Notebook to a scheduled reading conference as a tool to support discussions and demonstrate their thinking and progress. Students can be involved in the assessment process by monitoring their own goals and progress as readers, reading over their entries at different points in the year, reflecting on their entries using specific criteria, and identifying what they are doing well as a reader to help to set goals for improvement. In remote learning, we can gather the same information using digital platforms, which allows students to demonstrate their thinking when reading in the same way that a physical Reader's Notebook does. As I mentioned earlier, it's important for teachers to read through students' Reader's Notebooks regularly, and there's a number of look-fors when reading these notebooks and monitoring student progress. First of all, we want to be analysing the students' thinking about what they have read, thinking associated with the comprehension strategies, including their predictions, questions, inferences, connections, and visualizations. Their notebook entries might also reveal new ideas and possibilities that the book has provoked. Teachers also want to look for reflections a student has written on the comprehension strategies they use and how these strategies have helped them to understand texts more deeply. This can be connected to their personal reading goals and plans for growth. Structured and direct responses that were first modelled by the teacher are also important to look for when going through a Reader's Notebook. For example, a history of a reader or finding the spark strategy might have been taught to the class and then completed by a student. So on the right here is an example of a Reader's Notebook entry from a Year 4 student. You can see that they used a sticky note whilst they were reading and recorded a text-to-self connection, which explains their feelings and fear of sharks when they swim at the beach. This student has then expanded upon this and explained their connection in more detail in their Reader's Notebook. Making connections is one of the content descriptors in the Victorian curriculum for both Level 3 and 4. The next steps for this student might be to describe how the connection helped them to understand the book they were reading. However, this would also depend on other observations the teacher has made. All of the entries that students put into their Reader's Notebook help teachers to paint a picture of their students and identify next learning steps. So this is a primary example of Reader's Notebook entry, but they are also really fantastic to use in secondary schools. I'm now going to ask Bron a question. Bron, would you be able to tell us about a strategy that is effective for older students to use?
Andrew, I think that one of the things that's really important when we're talking about primary and secondary students and Reader's Notebooks is that we're all we're all readers, and we're all learning to grow and strengthen our practice as readers. So when we're working with secondary students, we would still also ask them to make connections, but we would deepen that knowledge and we would extend that with them. So I've actually been looking at some reading capabilities, a document that's been put together recently by McGraw, Mason and Lee, and they're talking about connection making at the secondary level is about weaving. So it's about linking to personal experience. It's about linking to broader socio-cultural, historical and political context. It's about linking to other literary experiences and linking ideas and recognising themes and patterns. And so I think, and the same text that this student has read, we would obviously be reading perhaps a more complex text, but we're still using those main themes of connection. So that's what I would do.
Thanks so much, Bron. That's a really fantastic point. Just because we're getting older doesn't mean that we then stop using some of the strategies that we've learnt in some of those younger years. We keep using those. Sometimes we're aware of we're using them, or they also can become autonomous. And you're right that we start using those strategies with more complex texts, and the depth of thinking that is associated with those strategies is then deeper from that too. Thank you very much. So we now have another Padlet prompt for you all to respond to as we're nearing what is hopefully the end of this remote learning period. I mentioned earlier that digital platforms can be used in a similar way as readers' notebooks and provide rich portfolios of student work. So the next Padlet prompt is, what is something significant you have learnt about your students as readers through their digital reading responses throughout this remote learning period? So for example, I've learnt a lot about the topics that really interest students. This has been evident in the books they have chosen when on Get Epic, an online reading platform we've been using at my school, and through their responses explaining what they have learnt when completing text responses on Seesaw. I've used this information to engage students in future lessons, particularly for some that might have been otherwise challenging to motivate. So if you could all head over to the Padlet discussion board now and respond to this question. And that concludes the assessment of readers part of the webinar. So whilst everyone is responding on the Padlet, I'm going to hand over to you, Chris, to discuss the wonderful responses to the previous Padlet prompt on how formative assessment tools and strategies are having an impact on student learning. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Well, it's amazing how quickly people were able to put a formative assessment lens into that discussion about the assessment of readers. Some great dialogue coming through on the Padlet in and around formative assessment with reading, and the strong theme was that targeted learning goals that were inextricably linked to teaching sequences, learning goals that formed part of exit tickets out of classrooms and checking in with success criteria. Lots of references to the power of the conference, lots of references to strategy-based instruction and differentiation. So thanks so much, everyone, for really getting into what you consider to be the formative assessment components that work for you. Terrific. You've got something else to consider in terms of remote learning with your digital responses to reading assessment, and I'll hand back over to Bron for the next phase of our webinar.
Brilliant. I'm just so amazed at the responses that we're receiving through our Padlet and the way that our group of participants are interacting with this idea of balanced assessment. And we're very busy writing down all of your questions to move on at the end. We'll get to those. So there's some really key themes coming through and we will get to those. So our final presenter today is Amanda, and she's going to share with us some really key ideas and practical application of the assessment of writers. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Bron, and good afternoon to everybody watching today. So we're going to move on to the balanced assessment of writers, and when we consider the assessment of our writers, we must ensure that there's a strong focus on each child as an author. So the second quote here by Anderson is one that will guide our thinking today about the balanced assessment of writers. and that is that a lifelong writer is someone who exhibits 3 characteristics. The writer initiates writing, the writer writes well, and the writer has a process that works for him or her. So we can see that assessment of writers is much more than just assessing how well they write, and here's a table that represents that. Along the top in the orange, you can see 4 different aspects that we need to understand, teach and assess. So the students' motivation and engagement, their ability to initiate writing, their writing process, and of course, how well they do write. And down the left-hand side in the column, we've got a range of tools and strategies that we can explore to get some data on these aspects. In the Padlet, if you would like to jump in there again and just pop in, which one of those 4 aspects in orange do you feel most confident about teaching and assessing, and which one do you feel least confident about teaching and assessing? Okay, so here we can see in the green boxes the different tools and strategies and which aspects of those they actually help us assess. So if we look down the side to moderated writing assessments, we can see that that's a really good tool to choose if we're going to be finding out about how well the students are writing, but it's not so great for understanding their motivation or engagement or initiation abilities. So we look at conferring, for example, the second one there, and we can see that all 4 boxes are green. So that's a really good, strong tool to assess any of the aspects of our writers. So it's necessary to have a varied repertoire of assessment approaches, and we'll talk through these today. And we'll spend some time learning about conferring because it is such a powerful tool for us to gather data on all aspects of our writers. So writers' motivation and engagement, and you can see down the bottom in the corner there, you'll see which aspect I'm talking about with each slide in the orange square. So motivation and engagement. There is a strong relationship between writing motivation and writing achievement. The mindset that students bring to writing will influence their development, and one of our roles as educators is to foster and model a positive attitude to writing. We need our young writers to be confident in expressing themselves in the written form, and understanding their dispositions and attitudes gives us that knowledge needed to develop writing sessions that build on and enhance their writing self-efficacy. So, how can we learn about their dispositions and motivations? Well, of course, we need to gather some data. We can gather data on, do they like writing? Why or why not? What do they like to write about? What do they think good writers do? What strategies do they use as a writer? And what do they think they can do to be an even better writer? So one way to do this is through a writing survey, and we would encourage you to administer this early in the school year to get some ideas about the students' attitudes, and then to re-administer that towards the end of the year and see how much growth there has been in the students' responses, and that will give us really good evidence of our impact of teaching. Another way we can monitor the students is by watching them during independent writing time. And here is an example of an engagement inventory, which is a simple coded checklist that we can use while observing our writers and their behaviours. So we can create a key and check for the students. Are they writing actively? Are they conferring with a peer, looking around, using a resource, moving around the classroom, or are they doing anything but writing? And what we will see will help us to plan the next steps in our teaching. And there may be particular students, of course, you would know some probably, who might need this sort of monitoring more than others to help increase their active writing time. Now we will move on to assessing students' ability to initiate writing. We know that students who are initiators of writing understand that writing is powerful and can be used to achieve things that are important to them. They understand that writing is a meaningful experience and they get great satisfaction out of struggling with the crafting process and producing a piece that they value. They understand purpose, genre, and audience. They can write for different purposes, such as to share something important with others or to provide information on an interesting topic or review a film or book. They can write in different genres and make informed choice about which genre might be best for their purpose. And they can write with their audience in mind. So, how can we assess students as initiators of writing? Well, again, we need to gather some information. We can observe how they use the workshop or lesson time. Can they work independently and effectively? We can read their writer's notebook entries. Do they write outside of school? Are they experimenting with strategies taught in mini lessons? And can they gather ideas for future pieces? And we can also talk to the student writer. Can they articulate why they are writing a piece? Can they explain their topic and genre choices? And can they tell you about their intended audience? So it's through observation, reading their writing and talking with them that we can gather valuable assessment information. Here we have a couple of examples of writing logs, and these can be used to also gather information about their ability to initiate writing. The first example there allows students to jot down what they intend to achieve in a session, and then at the end of the session to reflect on what they actually did get done. And the second one allows students to track the writing they do and include the different genres they may write in, and also include what stage of the writing process they are up to. And this is valuable data for us. So if we've got a student who's constantly choosing to write in fiction forms, we'd know that we need to work on developing their desire and capacity to communicate informationally. And if we have a student who is labouring in the drafting stage, we know that we can teach them some effective ways to revise. That brings us to assessing the student's writing process. So as we gather information about students' writing process, we need to remember that there is not just one writing process. Writers move in and out of the steps in individual ways. We need to assist them to find a process that works for them and give them the skills to execute the different stages. And ultimately, the measure of the effectiveness of their process is going to be how well they write. And we can see that integral to that is feedback. So feedback is provided at all stages of the writing process, and that's our balanced assessment. When we gather information about their processes, through observation and conferring, we can use this to inform our teaching. This next table gives us some examples of some common student behaviours and some possible teaching responses. So, for example, in the middle there, if they're having difficulty finding topics, we could explore the writer's notebook. How well they write. So this is an aspect of writers that we are quite good at assessing generally, teachers, and it's one that we plan for, the moderated writing tasks. So as we gather information about the student's writing process, we need to remember, wrong one. So there's many tools that we can use to assess how well they write, and here's just 3 examples. So we've got the 6+1 traits, which some schools have adopted, and that works on developing the student's capacity to develop ideas, their organisation, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, conventions and presentation. Another option is using the criteria that's provided from ACARA through the NAPLAN assessment. And here in brackets, you can see the points weighting that's given to each of those different criteria. So for example, sentence structure in the ACARA criteria is worth 6 marks in the weighting. And a third choice that we have for how well they write and assessing it is the Vika learning progressions. And these describe how students become increasingly proficient at creating texts for an increasing range of purposes. Students' writing moves from representing basic concepts and simple ideas to conveying abstract concepts and complex ideas, in line with the demands of the different Victorian curriculum learning areas. So there's a few different tools on offer here, and it will usually come down to a whole school decision as to which tool is used for the moderated writing assessments. Next, we have the Writer's Notebook. The Writer's Notebook has an important place in the classroom where balanced assessment is occurring. It is important to ensure a comfort zone for the Writer's Notebook, and teachers are actually discouraged from grading the notebook as a whole, but it is important to confer and to talk to the students about their entries, because we can gather some strong data on their motivation and engagement, ability to initiate writing, and how well they write. So we can assess student notebooks by reading their entries or asking the students to place sticky notes on particular entries that they've created. We could give them some criteria, such as to mark an entry that they really enjoyed writing, or an entry where they tried something new with the craft of writing, or an entry that shows their best, or an entry that they really struggled with. Conferring with the student and asking them to talk about the entries they have included over the past week gives us valuable data. So we'll spend a moment now to consider conferring with our writers due to the rich data it can give us. And here is a quote. The word assessment derives from the Latin word assidere, which means to sit alongside. And this is a useful metaphor for assessment, particularly in the classroom. The second quote here comes from Carl Anderson, who is a respected educator who spent many years teaching teachers about conferring with writers. And he says, a writing conference is first and foremost a conversation. The word conversation suggests so many things about the way you should talk with your students. The goal of a writing conference is to teach students something about writing that they can use in the future. If you add to students' writing repertoire in every conference, they become better writers over time. And now on the next slide, we'll have a look at a summary table of his suggested moves during a writing conference. So there are different stages of the conference, different moves the teacher may make, and different intentional language choices they may use to get the most out of that precious time they spend with their writers. The first stage is to discover what the student is doing as a writer. And to do this, we can invite the student to just tell us about what they're doing as a writer. You might say, how's it going? The next stage is to assess what we see in their writing and decide what we might teach. It's important to only teach one thing in one conference. So we need to listen to what the student says to do this and look at the writing and make a decision then about what is the one thing that we can teach them now that will have the greatest impact on their writing moving forward. You might say to them, let's have a look at your writing. And finally, we need to teach them something. This is giving them feedback or coaching and linking that to their independent work. Here you might do a quick model, or you might use a mentor text to show them an example of how an author has tried a certain craft that you think would benefit their writing. And you might use some language such as, I want to give you some feedback. Now I'm going to teach you. Let's try this together. And at the end, now I want you to go and try what we've talked about on your own. And that is a little summary of how Carl Anderson suggests a conference may run with writers. And you can actually find videos of him with writers from preschool age right up to secondary school, late secondary school age on the Heinemann blog. I will now hand back to Bronwyn and we'll have some webinar assignment and then move into some Q&A.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amanda. I loved what you had to say about the writer's notebook as a tool. And I think that that's something that's coming really strongly through the Padlet chat at the moment, is that question around how do we use the writer's notebook as a tool if it's a space for students? And I think that the key is in that word tool, in the fact that, our writer's notebook needs to be a place for creativity and for experimentation, but also the place for rehearsal and brainstorming stages of that writing cycle. And the key in there is that we put it back on that student agency. You talked about the student might select this to show you, or the student might select that. And this way, they've got ownership over what it is that they're sharing. We're not marking it as a whole, but we're using that writer's notebook as a tool and as that key piece of, or that key artifact that the student can bring to a conference, and that they can develop themselves as a writer through that. So that was fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. And I think it's also really worth saying that we can use this from foundation when students are really just illustrating and draw, label, caption all of the way through to year 12 when they're annotating. There's really complex text. There's huge ways that we can use our writer's notebook. All right, so we are going to jump now into our webinar assignment. So you've got around 10 minutes to put this information into your assignment on BASTO 307. So what you'll need to do is describe the tools you currently use to assess reading and writing in your school, and then how will you strengthen your assessment approaches from what you have learnt in this webinar. So I think it's really important that we spend time thinking about our current practice, because this will also allow us to audit, like Chris mentioned earlier, and consider our approach. Why do we use the tools that we use, and what impact are they having? The second component really allows us to look forward. How will we strengthen our assessment approaches from what we've learnt in this webinar? It might be that you've been introduced to some brand new tools that you've never considered, or perhaps you've been prompted to tweak or refine your current work. We really look forward to reading your responses and continuing to grow as this very large community of practice together, strengthening the teaching and learning of literacy across our state. So while you are entering in your responses there, we're going to do a bit of a Q&A around some of the key things that have come up in our Padlet today. So you can continue to put questions in that you have there while we're talking, and we'll select a couple of this and really ensure that the voice of all of our presenters are covered. So one of the key things that has come through is around how we manage our time, both in a secondary space and in a primary space. How do we find the time to teach and assess? So how do we find the time to balance the formative and the summative? And I think Lisa spoke to it earlier about that swiftly flowing river. Things move so quickly in our work, and how do we find time to balance all of that? So I'm going to throw first to Lisa. Perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about your reflections on that in that space.
Thanks, Bron. It's a really good question, and one I've certainly grappled with teaching year 7 to 9, which is what I'm going to talk to in particular. I think sometimes in secondaries we can particularly be focused on our explicit instruction and perhaps don't leave quite enough time if we're looking at the workshop model for that work time, because it's during the work time that if we're strategic, we can balance opportunities between students working together in group work and create opportunities for us to do some conferring either individually or in small groups. I think perhaps it's a little bit of a change of a mindset about how our time is best used, especially in the secondary context. I think we think we're the owners of the content, but we can give content for students to talk about and make really wonderful opportunities for one-on-one or small group talk.
And Lisa, how would you go about convincing leadership or people sort of in your school, key players in your school, how you might introduce some of these more formative practices in a secondary setting?
Well, I'm probably on that journey right now. I think one of the biggest blockers, as I read in one of the Padlet questions, was about summative tasks. And my argument at the moment is that disengagement and lacking motivation is probably one of the biggest blockers for us for developing readers and writers, and those summative tasks tend to do that. I'd also argue that a focus on developing these students as readers and writers is actually going to give them all the dispositions and skills that they need to do effective essays. Based on the research I've read, we don't need to be teaching TEAL essays for students from year 7 to 9 and maybe even 10. We want to develop their capacities as readers and writers, and they'll actually do far better in those essays we're so worried about in the end if we do that in a really productive, engaging way in those junior years.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa. I wonder, Andrew, if you might be able to speak at the other end of the spectrum. How do you find time to teach those really crucial early years skills and work students through the middle of school and assess at the same time? How do you balance the load?
Well, I think it's really important to incorporate that into your planning as a part of your lesson design as well. So I really like to, in my planning, target a few students that I would like to get to particularly in that middle part of the workshop model. And I also think that it shouldn't necessarily be something separate to what's going on with the rest of your class. So it shouldn't be an extra thing. It should be a conversation based around what they're already working on and what you'd already want to be as the teacher with your teacher presence, moving around to the room and observing. So it's just being a little bit more intentional about your teacher presence and the way that you can use that effectively to assess students. Back to you, Bron.
Thanks, Andrew. So my next question is for Amanda. Something that's come up on the Padlet quite a lot is around foundation students. How do we use these formative assessment strategies like the Readers and Writers Notebook for students who are really just learning to communicate with the written word?
Yeah, it's a great question. And really, it's looking at that motivation and engagement, and it's looking at that ability to initiate writing. So when you're a foundation student, any mark on the page is communication. So if the student has an idea, can form an idea, and then can put a picture or some letters onto the page and talk with their teacher about what that is initiating writing, and that is being motivated and engaged enough to want to have a go. So definitely the Writer's Notebook can be used in the foundation levels. And the nice thing about the notebook for the students there is that's a place where the teacher's not going to actually write on their work. Okay, so the teacher could use sticky notes to give some feedback, right, drawing a smiley face or something that can communicate with the student. But it's not somewhere where the teacher's going to come and tick each letter that's correct. That would be on a different piece of paper, okay? So, yep, definitely you can use them in foundation levels. It might not be every day, but to have a special place where they can put their ideas is very valuable, and they take great pride in their writer's notebooks. And having a class writer's notebook that the teacher models with is a great way to show how they can be used.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Amanda, talking about the teacher as that model and really showing the students this is where you are now, but look where you might be able to go next. And the teacher really demonstrating the things that we would like our students to be doing. Chris, have you got some other ideas about writer's notebooks for junior students or readers' notebooks?
Exactly the same thing, Bron and Amanda. Yes, I think the articulation of it from a teacher perspective with the modelling and the thinking aloud and the scaffolding, and it connects for children. Well, what does it mean to be a writer? And as we were going through and moving through with Amanda, all of those different components of what it means to be a writer have to be explicitly modelled and shared. So the process has got to be taken from within to outside of us in a very creative way, so that students feel like they really are readers and writers because they understand that process. And that notion of what is the reading process in our school, what's the writing process in our school, is critical to it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris. We've just got a couple of minutes left in our Q&A today. And I think one of the things coming through is that we've got this enormous range of tools available to us. And the way in which we as teachers are going to be able to determine which is the most effective tool is we need to continually build our knowledge. We need to continually be learners and working alongside our students there, so that we're not overwhelmed with this plethora of experiences, but we can really critically work through the formative assessment and select something that's really going to be spot on and precise for what our students need. The last question I'm going to pose to our panel of facilitators today is around an effective formative assessment tool or approach that you have used, a go-to. An example for me, something that I love to use as an assessment tool for writers, usually at the beginning of the year, is a task from Ralph Fletcher called History of a Name. And I love it because it's accessible to everybody. Everybody has a name and everyone can tell a story about that name. So it really shows us, it gives the students, I guess, the ability to access content with which they're familiar, but you can take it in any way. I know Kay Cobbin loves to do that activity with adult learners also. So from foundation students learning to write their name all of the way through. And like Amanda was talking about, it can assess the motivation to write. It can assess how well they write and the qualities and the process that they use in that space. Amanda, I wonder if you might also be able to talk about an effective tool or approach that you use.
Sure. So in a reading or writing classroom or any lesson really, I really like to use the success criteria to its full potential and bring that to life throughout the lesson. So we spend time creating it at the beginning of the lesson, but its greatest value is when we give the students time to reflect on it throughout the lesson. So if you've got a workshop model, really using that catch time to stop and check in with the success criteria. You could have students rank at that stage which criteria they're finding the easiest to meet, or down to which one they're struggling with, or they may pop their initials on the board. If it's on a whiteboard, just go and pop their initials next to the one that they're finding a challenge, or the one which they're doing really well in, and other students can then pair up who's, oh, okay, I can see James is really working out how to do that, and they could even get some advice from James and so on. It's a quick way for the teacher to be able to see where the students are at in that lesson.
Thanks, Amanda. What about you, Lisa?
I'm going to look at it from a Year 12 literature perspective, and the thing that I find really useful, I use it either as an admit or an exit slip, is annotations. So I give kids, it can be simply one line or a small passage of text, and I get them to annotate their thinking about it. Now that might be at a simple level making connections, but at a Year 12 level that might be looking at authorial intent and doing that, making inferences based on the language features that they identify in that passage. Gives me so much information about their reading comprehension.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Very concise. Andrew?
Well, at the other end of the scale, I think listening to reading is, for me, is just important, particularly for those younger readers and those EAL readers, because that too gives you so much information in a short amount of time. So you can learn about their reading behaviours, their ability to decode texts, identify their strengths, and to then be able to set goals with students to be able to work on until the next time you meet with them.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrew. And I really like how you've been able to bring in that EAL perspective also. I think it's really important that we consider all of the cultural needs of our students and all of the individual experiences that our students bring with them as they learn to read and to write. So I'm going to pass finally to Chris to share an idea around formative assessment, a tool or approach that works really well for him, and then he's going to wrap up our session today. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Bron, and thanks everyone for those wonderful contributions. Yeah, finally for me, I think it would be the connect between those 5 key strategies of formative assessment that Lisa was talking about in lesson design, that connection between learning intention, success criteria, and student goal setting. And so many of the Padlet prompts were really effusive in that idea about how important it is for students to set goals and for us as teachers to know what the learning journey is, what's the writing process, what's the reading process, and what are the sequences. So for me, it was that connection between us knowing exactly what the lesson plan is all about and what's next for those students as learners, because if we don't know that, we've got problems. So that was a strong takeaway. Thanks for the rich Q&A, and we'll keep checking the Padlet, so please don't hesitate to add any other thoughts and reflections that you might have. Right, as we start to bring things together, it's been a really powerful webinar. Coming back to our learning intention, we wanted to build and strengthen our collective understanding of a balanced assessment model to inform literacy teaching and learning. Hopefully you've now got a strong sense of what that balance is between formative and summative assessment. We had 2 specific success criteria elements. Firstly, the range of instructional strategies and artefacts that you're going to use to present a balanced assessment practice in your classroom, but more importantly, to inform our teaching. And we had such quality, positive tools in our success criteria tonight around positive student disposition. So just the attitude to becoming readers and writers and the range of tools and techniques we would use. So let's start to bring things together for the next step, or the next steps for you. As mentioned, please continue to have a look at our Padlet summary, and we're going to try and put together, we haven't got to all of your questions and all of your wonderful sharings and reflections, so we will continue to build that. Please have your webinar assignment as an action statement for yourself and your team at your school, and please engage with your virtual COP via the webinar for discussion board, because that will enable you to start to network and connect so strongly in and around what we believe is just a critical aspect of our instructional practice. And before I head back to Laura, just a special thanks to the team tonight. We've enjoyed putting the webinar together for you, but to our team, Bron and Amanda and Lisa and Andrew, we hope tonight that you've been able to get a sense of Foundation to Year 12. That was our intention when we started to think about this webinar, formative assessment across all year levels. So we were excited to work with the content and work with you, and we look forward to continuing that conversation. So a huge thanks to our Webinar 4 team and to Laura and the technical team behind the scenes at Basta, and I'll hand back to Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. That was so lovely. And I would love to echo what Chris has said. Thank you so much to the team tonight for another wonderful webinar. So as you can see, based on the visual on your screen at the moment, we are nearing the end of the series of 5 webinars and the course. Please make sure you keep your eyes peeled on your inbox, as an announcement will be sent shortly to everyone to confirm your virtual workshop dates and actually outline how you can successfully complete the course. Please remember to post your webinar assignments and connect with your virtual community of practice. It's been great to see assignments being submitted thick and fast on my phone this afternoon already, so it's wonderful to see that you're all still staying engaged. I'm especially looking forward to seeing everyone engage with the discussion board prompt and share what formative assessment practices you're using to assess reading and writing, and which of these have the greatest impact on student learning at your school. So I can't believe that we're up to webinar 5. It seems like 2 seconds ago that we started this journey with you all. So please remember to tune in on Wednesday, the 21st of October from 4 o'clock PM, where the final webinar hopes to tie everything that you've learnt together. So all the best to all of Metro Melbourne as you transition back to face-to-face teaching, and to everyone in the rural areas who is face-to-face teaching, all the best for the weekend so you can recover from the week that you have had. So looking forward to seeing you all on the 21st of October. Look after yourself. Bye.